I'm Robert Tatum, the chair of Economic Research Hub at the Kirby Lang Center for Public Theology. The Economic Research Hub is one of the inaugural disciplinary hubs at the Kirby Lang Center. Our mission in the hub is to foster collaboration and feedback among scholars from fields of economics, theology, and biblical studies. Typically, our meetings are closed sessions where we're discussing ongoing research. However, today's event is special. Sponsored by our parent organization, the Kirby Lang Center, we are hosting a public event to highlight a remarkable book recently published by one of our esteemed members, Dr. Glenn Butner. So Glenn, he's here with us, and he's taught at Sterling College for 8 years, but he is about to start as an associate professor of theology at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary this fall. Of course, his latest book is titled Work Out Your Salvation, A Theology of Markets and Moral Formation. So we have an order of events. Dr. Butner will start by briefly presenting his book, followed by a distinguished panel that will provide their remarks and questions inspired by his work, to which Glenn will respond. So our panelists include Dr. Stephen Long, the Carrie M. McGuire University Professor of Ethics at Southern Methodist University. Welcome. Dr. Steve McMullen, Professor of Economics at Hope College and the editor of the Journal of Faith and Economics. Welcome. And myself, Dr. Robert Tatum, the Carrie Caperton Owen Distinguished Chair in Economics at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. After the panel, of course, we said Dr. Butner will respond to comments and questions that we raise, and then we'll open the floor for a brief Q&A session with the audience. So when we get to that, so we can get as many in as possible in a short time period, be as brief as possible with your questions so we can get to as many as possible. I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Butner, Dr. Long, and Dr. McMullen for their participation in this event, as well as to the Kirby Lang Center for sponsoring it. Special thanks also goes to Jordan Pickering for facilitating today's proceedings. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Glenn Butner. Glenn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Rob. And thanks to all of you for taking some time to be here with us today. I'm really honored at the opportunity to share what I've written and what I've been thinking about, and appreciate you just taking the time to join us virtually. I especially want to thank Robert Tatum and Stephen McMullen for proposing that we actually do this panel and for a lot of the logistics to make it happen. And thanks to Steve Long for being willing to come in and be a presenter so that we have another theologian on the panel, and also for a lot of input that he had in the process of writing this book, which began a little over a decade ago, working with Steve. Thanks also for the KLC leadership for helping put this on, especially Jordan Pickering, who is making sure that our Zoom doesn't crash right now. So I really appreciate it, all of you. That being said, in the time available today, I'd like to start by just giving a brief overview of the book's goals, given that most of you are probably unfamiliar with it. So the book has 3 sections, with the first partly focused on economics, the second focused on systematic theology, and the third on a synthesis between the 2 disciplines. Each section has its own goal, and if you understand these goals and have a rough sense of the way that I pursue them, then I think you'll have a rudimentary understanding of the book that will help you understand the rest of the conversation going on today. So my first goal is to dismantle 2 assumptions about markets that are often found in theological analysis of economics. Assumption 1 is that markets spontaneously emerge from society, and assumption 2 tends to treat markets as if they are uniform in their effects on moral formation. For example, Jay Richards offers a particularly eloquent account of the spontaneity of markets when he writes, quote, "What emerges from a free market regulated by prices is not utopia, but it is an order more complex and efficient than any order that human planners have or can devise," end quote. He draws on Hayek's idea of the spontaneous order of markets and Smith's language of the invisible hand, attributing the efficiency of markets to unintended and spontaneous human actions that, by providence, bring about an efficient and growing economy. Richards is arguing against the centralized government power setting all prices, production quantities, dividends, and so forth. And I think he's right here to note that planning of that sort is extremely difficult, not to mention sometimes accompanied by famine or bloodshed. But I think he's wrong in minimizing the other ways that markets are planned and designed. So I want to briefly consider a few aspects of market design that I treat in part 1. And I know some of you here are economists that probably know this better than me, and some of you here are theologians this might be newer for. So if you already know this, thanks for being patient. But economists can design different market mechanisms, for example, different auction methods. And then these different methods or mechanisms often result in different market equilibriums. Markets function differently based on what information is made available to the participants in markets. So to name only one popular level instance of this, market design at Amazon includes careful scrutiny of what information is made available to consumers and to sellers. Governments can regulate what can and can't be sold and who can and cannot sell it. Most fundamentally, it often takes effort to persuade people that something is exchangeable. So here we can think of efforts to convince the public of the viability of tradable pollution permits, for example. If each of these designs changes the economic outcome of market interactions, I propose in the book that many of them can also result in changes in the way markets shape us morally. Let me again offer a trivial example referencing Amazon. The company found that the institution of one-click shopping increased its sales. Now, we might hypothesize that this is due to reduced transaction costs, but I expect an analysis from behavioral economists would find that one-click shopping increased impulsive buys. At a moral level, we could wonder what effect a world of entirely one-click online shopping might have on our prudence or our wisdom. Does this sort of thing simply make us more impulsive? This leads to another assumption I intend to undermine. In the book, I discuss two examples of moral analysis of markets. The do commerce thesis, championed by Deidre McCloskey, argues that markets foster virtue. To succeed in markets, we need to be trustworthy, honest, hardworking, and have some individuals with the courage to be entrepreneurs. In other words, many in the group I call, lost my spot. In other words, or on the other hand, many in the group I call ecclesial ethics, for example, Daniel Bell, argue that markets are fundamentally corrupting. They breed vices like greed, and they harm the poor and the worker. In part one of my book, I argue that markets are actually varied in their moral effects, and this is partly because they can be designed in different ways. So at this point, I draw on experimental economics, a discipline whose numerous experiments have uncovered fascinating results for the analysis of markets. One of my favorite examples for the classroom involves an experiment with daycares in Israel. When experimenters convinced daycares to implement fines for parents who were late to pick up their children, late pickups counterintuitively increased in comparison with a control group that had no fines. One theory is that parents shifted from the framework of moral reasoning, where they had a responsibility to pick up their children on time, to the framework of consumption, where after-hours childcare came at the expense of the fine. This is but one example of many that suggests that incentives, or in this case a disincentive, can dramatically change how markets work. To summarize then, my first goal is to show that not all markets are the same, and that as a result, we can expect not all markets shape us morally in equivalent ways. This might prompt a theologian, ethicist, or economist interested in markets to ponder how a given market might be modified to improve its effect on moral formation. Now, here the attentive theologian might be somewhat puzzled by the emphasis given to markets. To greatly simplify things, theology tends to emphasize moral formation as a product of divine agency and grace. And so part two, therefore, turns to systematic theology with the goal of providing a theological framework for analyzing how market design is related to theological accounts of God's transformative work on Christians. And I pursue this goal in 3 steps. First, I draw on the theology of Catherine Tanner to develop an account of transcendence and concurrent human and divine action. In short, God transcends the world in a radical way while also being radically immanent to it. To use Tanner's terminology, God is not part of a kind, or, using classical language, God is not a member of a genus. The doctrine of analogy means that divine attributes and actions may be named with the same words we would use of similar creaturely attributes or actions. For example, God is strong, and so is a bodybuilder. But intuitively, we know that God's strength is different than a bodybuilder's, since it did not require lots of exercise and a high-calorie diet, to mention only one example. Yet the word strength is appropriate to use of God insofar as it communicates an increased range of abilities compared with the word weakness. Much more could be said, but for now I simply want to point out that both God and humans can be causes, but again, in very different ways. The word doesn't mean the same thing when applied to God and to humans. This means that humans can cause an event and God can cause the same event without human and divine causation being in competition with one another, because these two kinds of causes are so different. In other words, humans can be acting in markets, yet their actions can simultaneously be entirely caused by God. A further step is needed, though, since markets are more than just the sum of human actions. We might think of certain emergent properties or institutions, laws, policies, even geography as influencing how a given market is designed. I therefore introduce two theological categories: common grace and social sin. Common grace refers to God's gracious work to restrain sin across creation. Common grace also enables human beings who do not have the gift of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit to do more good than we might expect given the fall. This grace is oriented towards special grace, which refers to God's saving work within the church. I argue in the book that common grace is a helpful category for analyzing concurrent divine and human agency in markets, because it allows us to speak of any market-based positive moral transformation as a product of divine grace. Similarly, I develop an account of structures of sin and social sin that should be helpful in speaking about the way that markets, as something distinct from just the aggregate of human action, can corrupt character. I like to think that this chapter makes a real contribution to this theological discussion, but I've only really been able to share with you the bare bones account this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're located. A third theological step is needed, though. The Christian God is not an abstract monad, but the triune God of Scripture, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Any account of divine agency in markets needs to be Trinitarian, or else it is sub-Christian. A deist, for example, might agree with much of the theology I've already developed. When writing what I consider to be a qualified defense of markets, I was less concerned with deism, though, or with the specter of Karl Marx, than I was with the specter of Steve Long. In his book, Divine Economy, Long notes that many defenses of markets rely on doctrines like creation, providence, and sin without connecting to the heart of Christian theology by addressing doctrines such as Christology, the atonement, or ecclesiology. So far, I am guilty as charged. So in a final pivot, I offer an account of Trinitarian agency, briefly summarizing the doctrine of inseparable operations, the divine missions of the Son and the Spirit, and the practice of appropriation, which allows us to attribute one divine attribute or action more clearly to one of the three divine persons, even though it rightly applies to all of them together. In brief, I'm simply trying to give the reader a way to analyze concurrent divine action that can more precisely identify a given action as the Father's, the Son's, or the Spirit's. I then note three paradigmatic actions attributed to each person. The Father is associated with divine providence by appropriation. Christians are justified in the Son and are in union with the Son, and the Spirit indwells the Christian to bring about sanctification. I could have stopped writing here. At this point in the work, I've tried to give a more nuanced account of markets for the benefit of both defenders and critics of markets. I would hope that part one would provide two easy rejoinders to simplistic endorsements or rejections of markets. First, we might just ask, precisely which market design are you critiquing? And second, we could ask, is there any empirical evidence that the supposed moral harm or moral benefit of the given market design actually occurs? I also have tried to provide a precise theological lexicon to then analyze the various market formations that have occurred, carefully linked with matters that are the heart of the Christian faith. But if I stopped here, I would find the book fairly unsatisfying. After all, an analytic framework is only useful if it can actually be used to do something. So, in part three, I try to synthesize my analysis of economics and theology with the goal of offering 3 case studies in theological economics. I'll only treat these 3 case studies very briefly, since I believe that only the full chapters do them justice. I found brief summary more useful and more feasible for the first 2 sections. But turning to the first case study, our moral formation in markets depends partly on the socioeconomic context in which a market participant finds themselves. I draw on studies in experimental economics to suggest that wealth or income inequality may increase vice. I then draw on the theology of John Sobrino and Jean-Pierre de Caussade to explore how the spiritual discipline of the sacrament of the present moment can provide a way to respond to the social situations in which we find ourselves that may be detrimental to moral formation. Meanwhile, market design can provide ways to reduce economic inequality. As a second case study, I look at extensive experiments on racial, gender, and other forms of discrimination. Experiments known as correspondence studies and audit studies attempt to discover whether discrimination occurs in contexts like labor markets and mortgage markets. Consistently, they find evidence that suggests discrimination is occurring, though the nature of this discrimination is heavily debated. It might be bigotry, but many believe it is more based on uncertain information. I reply with a theology of justification that critiques all accounts of discrimination offered in the discussion, or at least those that I know as a theologian with a bachelor's degree in economics. The third case study looks at extensive literature on incentives, arguing that using incentives often, but not always, undermines the transformation that should occur by the Holy Spirit. Here, following what should be seen as a pattern now, I base my concern on experimental economics, offer a theological account of sanctification as faith worked out in love, and propose solutions that rely on market design. So that's a brief summary of the book, and I set out to make 3 goals in it. First, to offer a more nuanced account of markets and their effect on our moral formation. Second, to develop a theological framework that will help in analyzing markets in their various forms. And third, I sought to demonstrate how this novel approach could be deployed. I should qualify the last goal by noting that it's not entirely novel. Kate Ward has done exceptional work drawing on experimental economics and moral theology in her book, Wealth, Virtue, and Moral Luck. And I've been eagerly awaiting a book from Christina McRory, who at least a moment ago was with us, that should be loosely like my own. There are other examples I can name, but as a whole, I do think I'm taking a relatively new approach. The end result might just be new in kind of a weird way. And so with that in mind, I'd like to end this initial talk with a few brief remarks of self-analysis. So why do I think this approach is helpful? 3 quick benefits. First, I try to move beyond endorsements of capitalism and communism, concepts that I don't see existing in a pure form except in theory. The communism of China is not the communism of Cuba, nor is the capitalism of the United States in the 1970s the same as the capitalism of the United States today. I personally find it more helpful to move away from debating macroeconomic systems and toward specific market formations. This yields what I think could be a second benefit. In its current form, I don't imagine this book will do very much to help the local church. I doubt too many people in the local church are going to read it. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I'm writing it with the academy in mind. However, I do believe that the basic insights I'm using here could be tremendously beneficial to the church if deployed with that in mind in future projects. A local Baptist pastor, an Anglican rector, or a Presbyterian professor will have limited ability to resist capitalism if they feel so inclined, or to defend it, really, if for that matter. Most of us just don't have the power and ability to influence the macroeconomic system in which we find ourselves at that level. At most, I fear that preaching against capitalism can also often be reduced to what Young Mo Sung calls a contestatory theology, able to critique but not build. Similarly, Christian teaching in defense of capitalism can risk being a legitimating theology, endorsing a macroeconomic system without sufficiently considering the particular markets within that system and what those actual markets are doing. If we shift the conversation to specific markets, I think there is a much clearer point of contact for the local church. A local pastor can have significant impact on public discussion about zoning in their community. And a professor informed about labor markets might be more primed to do good in terms of the rising concerns about the distribution of funds at universities or the exploitation of adjunct faculty. I understand these to be questions about market design. What can be bought and sold in a location depends on how it is zoned. And universities are faced with debates about various market mechanisms. Will we negotiate collectively as a faculty union, sign a one-time tenured contract, or bid on classes as individual units in competition with adjuncts? Despite this, and I may be reading the wrong sources, I'm not familiar with many theological treatments of zoning, for example. So kind of my best case scenario of this book would push people to write exactly such content. I do also want to note 2 serious limitations that I'm aware of, though. As you'll soon see, overall, the respondents are quite kind in their remarks. At least I think they are. In brief moments of imposter syndrome last night, I've worried that economists are much more subtle in their critiques than theologians. We theologians like to tell our theological opponents that they are the Antichrist, or write books against opponents simply titled No. Both of those are Karl Barth, though the first one applies to many people. Perhaps I'm about to be roasted by 2 talented economists, and I just haven't picked up on the subtleties of it. But I don't think that's the case, and so instead, let me raise 2 more critiques against myself. These are things that looking back, or perhaps looking forward, I'd like to resolve. First, work out your salvation does not include a theology of the state. Critique of the state is actually one of the things that critics and defenders of capitalism can agree upon. In Michael Novak's mind, centralized power in a world of sin results in catastrophic evil, so we need capitalism and free markets to disperse power away from the state. Daniel Bell, who's a major critic not only of capitalism but also of Novak himself, still argues against politics as statecraft, as he calls it. This is a problem with liberation theology, Bell says. Their solution requires the state to fix things, and that's no solution at all for theological and pragmatic reasons. Does my work buck this trend? What role does the state have? I think I need to do more work here and perhaps in some future work. Another critique has to do with the use of economic experiments. Usually the output of such experiments is some quantifiable data. For example, an experiment finds rates of late child pickups after implementing a fine. Their inference was a shift from moral reasoning to utility calculus, but we can ask, is this a valid inference? I think so. But can we also quantify things like virtue formation, sanctification, or action that is fitting to our imputed identity in Christ through justification? I'm still a little confused and perhaps skeptical on how to work out that possibility. Yet, economics in its neoclassical form, at least as I understand it, is built on the process of measuring the unmeasurable. After all, what are utils? How do we discern the marginal utility of consumption? Utility is not easily measured, but the greatest economic minds of a century ago, in many sense, have devised a great range of theories for how to analyze invisible variables in these models. Or we could simply turn from the quantifiable to something less quantified, like the a priori praxeology of Ludwig von Mises. Theologians might prefer a turn away from what James K. A. Smith once called the tyranny of the empirical anyway. So I don't think that the problem of quantification is lethal to what I'm doing, but I am cognizant of the need to measure moral formation if we're going to try and design markets that maximize the possibility of the development of virtue. And as a theologian with only a limited math background, I feel a little daunted at the task. Having said that, that's an overview of my book and my understanding of what it contributes to the field of the discussion. I'm undoubtedly biased, though, so I now turn things over to three generous scholars to share their own remarks and questions. We'll begin with Steve Long. Thanks.
Thank you, Glenn. Let me thank the Kirby Lang Center for the invitation to participate in this panel. To Robert, to Jordan, and to Stephen, I'm very much appreciative being invited as the theologian. I always begin these discussions by reminding myself and everyone, I am a theologian and not an economist, and don't pretend to be one. I haven't even played one on TV. I also want to thank, of course, Glenn for his splendid work. It's a real joy to see a former student become a colleague and peer, and then, quite frankly, surpass your own work. That brings me just tremendous joy. I wrote Divine Economy, Theology in the Market a quarter of a century ago. And of the 200-some citations of that work, most are critical. That's to be expected. No one ever responds to a work, and hopefully no author ever says of their own, well, there, everything that needed to be said on that subject has now been said. At our best, I think, we write to initiate, guide, and contribute to an ongoing conversation. Sometimes that ongoing conversation in its criticism is reactionary, defending old positions or caricaturing the author's words and then dismissing a caricature. At other times, that ongoing conversation, even in its criticism, is salutary, advancing the conversation through careful attention to the work, pointing out its weaknesses and where it can benefit from nuance and development. The highest compliment I can pay to Glenn's Work Out Your Salvation is that it falls squarely into the latter camp. If I were to write a sequel to that earlier work, it would look a lot like Glenn's. It's one of the best works in theology and economics that I have read, and I could spend my time lauding this work, but instead will raise a few ongoing questions. A main thesis of my earlier work was that too many theologians working on the relationship between theology and economics were too accommodating of economics as a social science and too timid with theology. Weber's fact-value distinction had too influenced the state of the discussion, and thus theology was reduced to evaluation after the sociological facts were presented. Based on the material reality of the hypostatic union that divinity and humanity are united in one acting agent, Jesus, and that we're gifted through the church to participate in that agency, I made this rather controversial claim, quote, because this end is entrusted to sacred doctrine, theology has the task of evaluating the end of all other discourses, end quote. Now that assumes that all other disciplines have ends or purposes or goods that they inevitably serve. And while many critics found this too much, even smacking of triumphalism, Glenn worked assiduously not to let his experimental economics and market design set the ends for theology, but vice versa, and I think he was successful. But nonetheless, he still thought he needs to appeal to a weak positive normative distinction. He argues it is necessary, or quote, it would bring about the suspicion that the economy is infinitely malleable, purely a construct of values divorced from any material constraints. And I admit I don't quite understand that point yet. It would seem to me that the opposite should be the case. If we abandon thinking in terms of facts and values altogether, then neither economics nor theological ethics would be considered outside materiality, neither simply positioned in terms of facts or values. So here's my first question to Glenn. Why still work with this distinction? Does it at least tacitly concede too much to the social sciences? I'm not quite ready yet to concede the above critique to Glenn. However, I am ready to concede this one. He challenges my claim in Divine Economy that capitalism is unable to produce virtue. He then states that he seeks to, quote, pursue more nuance in his project, end quote, than I did mine. By drawing on experimental economics and market design, two disciplines with which I was and remain unfamiliar apart from Glenn's work, I think he accomplishes that well. For instance, he critiques my disagreement with my economist friend and co-author Nancy Fox, who argues that a market for kidneys would be Pareto optimal and much better than the current system. I agreed that it might be more efficient, but that efficiency is not the only consideration. Glenn, however, presents a market design for kidneys based on intentional design that, like him, I would fully endorse. He then suggests that my opposition to a market for kidneys was based on a faulty understanding of markets as determined solely by the price mechanism. I think that's correct. Yet within the dominant strain of capitalism, by which I mean the free market set forth in Hayek, Friedman, and the Mount Pelerin Society, isn't the market defined by the price mechanism? And when Glenn goes on to define the market, does it sneak into his definition? Here is his definition of the market. Quote, an imagined space where participants voluntarily buy and sell goods through a mechanism of exchange based on certain information, including price, end quote. Glenn then also cites Barnes' definition of capitalism, quote, it is nothing more than the result of countless individuals and corporate decisions, and for good or ill, the capitalism we have is the capitalism we have chosen, end quote. Here too, there seems to be an implicit appeal to the price mechanism as the basis for capitalism. So here are our second set of questions. Does Glenn agree with Barnes' definition? If so, how would it relate to the doctrine of providence and his emphasis on intentional human agency? Can you have markets within capitalism without the price mechanism? And can that lovely example of the New England program for kidney exchange be extended to markets for transportation, shelter, food, etc.? I find the latter promising because it would require intentional human agency in the construction of markets, rather than the unintentional agency that I think occurs through the price mechanism, and seems to be Barnes' definition. That matters because then the ends matter. And rather than Lionel Robbins' amoral, if not immoral, definition of economics as, quote, the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternate uses, end quote, economics could adopt Robert Skidelsky's understanding of its role, quote, the only defensible purpose of economics is to help abolish poverty, opening up a more spacious life for humanity, end quote. I think Glenn would agree with me on this point because his doctrine of providence moves in that direction. He states, quote, Where some theological accounts argue that markets spontaneously emerge from human society as evidence of God's providence, and here he's referring to J. Richards, the phenomenon of market design requires a more robust theology of providence that can balance intentional human agency in market design with divine providence. So here's a third set of questions. And this may get to the question he just raised about the state. Who designs markets? And how do we generate a politics and culture that recognizes markets are designed and not just natural? And how do design markets differ from some version of socialism, perhaps something like Christian socialism or sewer socialism? I have so much more that I would like to discuss with Glenn about his superb book. So let me conclude with one more question, one which I think I have the answer to. If the Spirit works sanctifying grace through the market, could the market replace the church without loss? I'm confident you'll say no to that, Glenn. But what I'm really interested in knowing is the next part of the question. If not, why not? Thank you very much.
And it now falls to me, an economist, to weigh in as well. Thanks, Steve, for your comments. Thanks, Glenn, for your good introduction, and of course for writing the book. I'm Steve McMullen. As Rob introduced me already, I teach economics at Hope College in Michigan. I should also, of course, thank Jordan and Craig and everybody at the Kirby Lang Center for hosting this event, and all of you for tuning in and listening and engaging with this as well. What I want to do here real quick is three things. I want to first explain why I think Glenn's book is really good, what I really appreciate about it. Second, I want to offer a kind of a note of caution as an economist reading through this book. And then third, I want to ask two big questions that I think will resonate with what Steve has already done. Two big questions about kind of the implications of the work and where we'd go from here. So first, what I appreciate most about this book, and right from the beginning when I was introduced to Glenn's work a few years back, is that this book is interdisciplinary in a way that most interdisciplinary books are not. And I say that as someone who's written a couple of these and maybe written them poorly. But what Glenn accomplishes is that he manages to speak about economics in a way that economists would recognize. This is very difficult. So Butner begins with the premise that the details that economists pay close attention to in market design, for example, probably really matter for how we evaluate markets. Now, this may seem obvious, but it's not. In the broad literature of books and think pieces that evaluate capitalism or defend capitalism or condemn it, most people just treat markets and market economies as if they're different versions of essentially the same thing. And Glenn was talking about this in his introduction as well. Now, economists do this too, to be fair. When we participate in these big ideological debates, we also treat markets as if they're some kind of ideal type. But when professional economists do our serious work, we're generally not asking these big questions of evaluating capitalism. And so most of the time, economists are digging into the details about market design and market context. Most of the time, we're asking for empirical evidence about a question that we just don't know the answer to. So when Butner assumes from the start that the questions that he wants to answer require that he goes and gathers high-quality empirical evidence, an economist is going to feel at home. And I think a lot of people with a kind of an empirical scientific mindset are going to feel at home reading a large chunk of this book. So this is where economists usually start, but not where philosophers and theologians usually start. And it's one of the reasons why economists usually tend to ignore big debates with philosophers and theologians, is because it doesn't look to most economists like this is serious economics work. Now, Butner writes about economics as somebody, as a result, who not just understands economic ideas, I want to claim, but he's writing as someone who understands how to make an argument that social scientists would accept. And that just means he's kind of bilingual in a sense, and that's just really valuable. Now, not every chapter is aimed at economists. A big piece of this book, as you now can tell, is aimed at theologians. Glenn noted that chapter 6 is devoted entirely to explaining how his account of divine and human agency is Trinitarian. That's not the kind of question that economists care about as much, but it is important theologically, and it's part of his larger project, and he does it very well. So this is all to say that Glenn has written a book here that is, I think, good theology and also good economics. And I think that's going to make it more useful to the church and more useful to the academy as a result. Okay, so that's what I really appreciate, and it's the reason why I'll keep coming back to this book, I think, again and again. So let me move on to my first note of caution. Now, there's a number of sections of this book where Glenn draws on experimental or empirical evidence to illustrate or to demonstrate something about moral formation and economies. In most of these sections, I would describe the evidence that he draws upon as tentative or preliminary and definitely contested. Experimental economics is a small field, and it's a new field, and the things that we've learned in these experiments are not usually well integrated into the rest of the discipline. An example. In chapter 7, Glenn examines the relationship between social class and wealth and inequality and moral behavior, and he presents some provocative evidence. An example is people from rich households are apparently, in some contexts, less generous than everyone else. Now, here's the thing. This is a really complicated literature, and few social scientists would look at this evidence and say, that's definitely right. We have that relationship totally figured out. And not even close, right? This is part of a big conversation. And the same goes for his sections about market design and inequality and the interactions with economic culture. So he does a good job of drawing on this evidence, but because the evidence is tentative, we need to be careful. Now, I don't think that this limits his larger argument. I just advise readers to take this book as an invitation to a new set of questions, and an invitation to dive into the details, and not as a reference for the kinds of things we definitely know about moral behavior and moral formation in economic life. And Glenn, of course, can respond to this. I think, though, this is exactly what he's going for, that he wouldn't think of it as a kind of a reference volume. Now, that leads me to sort of the two big questions that I want to ask Glenn. Mostly, where do we go from here kind of questions. But let me set the first one up a little bit. Often when Christians argue about the edifying or corrupting nature of institutions, we're doing it with a particular question in mind. And the question would be something like this. Should Christians be content with capitalism? Or should we try to organize our lives differently? Can we imagine something better? Now, I see this particularly in the theological critiques of economics and the critiques of capitalism for the last 30 years, as Glenn notes and Steve noted as well. Now, these critiques come in different forms. One critique is the contention that market or economic or utilitarian logic seems to be becoming the dominant way of thinking in more areas of life that were not considered economic in the past. Another part of the literature, which Glenn focuses quite a bit of time on, argues that market logic trains us to love things in the wrong way, or to love the wrong things, or just to be worse people in some sense. And maybe a third section of this literature, which is probably the biggest, just argues that market institutions are fundamentally unjust, and that they're premised on exploitation of those without economic power and on the destruction of the planet. Now, in response to some of these critiques, of course, there's other theologians and social scientists that defend markets and argue that they are, in fact, good for the poor, good for the planet, good for human culture, or good for human character. The contribution of the book, as I see it, and apparently as Glenn sees it in his introduction, is to kind of dial that whole debate back a bit and argue that markets can be good for people, or they can be bad for people. Or sometimes they're good in one way, but bad in another. Economies are not a monolithic good or evil. Furthermore, we can reasonably understand the possibility of market formation through participation, moral formation through markets, as part of God's gracious work of sanctification in our lives. So here's the question. Where exactly does that leave us? I think Glenn has a vision that most economists would embrace. The message is that there's a lot at stake when we do economics and politics and law and business. The practice of forming these social institutions is one where the details matter. The institutions can either form us into more moral people, or they can corrupt and make us less moral. So that means good economics could be good for our soul, and bad economics could be bad for our soul. Well, maybe not. I get confused when I talk about souls, so I'll let the theologians correct me on that one. Here's the thing. It seems like this could be a call, if we run the argument out, just to recruit a new generation of technocrats, maybe moral philosopher technocrats of virtue or something like that. These folks would ask questions, not just about GDP or economic growth or unemployment rates or public health. They'd also ask questions about racism and virtue and character. Maybe we should be making education policy and financial law thinking about the kinds of practices that we're asking people to participate in and what kind of people we are forming when they go to work every day. Now, the language of like a technocrat of virtue may sound alarming, but I think on balance, this vision is good. We need people dedicated to studying business law. And wouldn't it be better if those people were well-versed in how the rules of the game could create better or worse people, or at least lawyers and economists who are asking these questions? That's all a bit of a setup for my second question, though. I want to go back to the fact that most people entering this conversation are still wondering, kind of a more basic way, how should I relate to capitalism? Should Christians be looking for an alternative way to organize our lives? This is the question I don't think I have an answer to when I reach the end of the book. I think the work of the theologian critics like Jamie Smith, Stephen Long, Catherine Tanner, and others is calling us to let our theology inspire a kind of thinking about social life that doesn't always fit into modern economics. A mature Christian community, I think they say, would naturally resist the influence of capitalism. Or perhaps it would generate new kinds of institutions that are not dependent on this kind of extrinsic market logic that we depend on today. Now, should we give up on that vision? Do we need to resist capitalism? Is our job just to reform it with better market design, maybe even to embrace it under some conditions? Like, what's the basic posture of the church? This is the hard question I think that Christians are continually asking, because capitalism is the world we live in. And it's the kind of question that we all need to have an answer to every day when we go to work. And I think Glenn is in a position to really help us answer that question well. Okay, that's it for me. Let me now turn it over to Rob.
All right, it's tough going after all these wonderful people, so I will give it a try, and I appreciate everyone being here. Let me start this out a little bit different than I was planning, though my comments will, questions for Glenn will still be the same as I had planned. But I was recently talking to my undergraduate academic advisor and professor, so an economist, and he's aware of the kind of work I'm doing now in theology and economics. And he's like, hey, can you give me some, like, seminal works in this area? And it sometimes feels hard to be able to do that. And so part of what I'm happy about seeing is not just Mary Hirschfeld recently had a couple years back had a book. Now Glenn's, Christina's coming up. It feels very different than the world I have seen before on the interaction between economics and theology. So my undergraduate days, this was actually the book that first helped me start thinking about, and I'll tell you what it is in a second if you didn't get to see that, thinking about, economics and theology can interact. And so it was For the Common Good by Herman Daly, a heterodox economist, and John Cobb, a theologian. And so, they sort of, get back to what I think Glenn is trying to argue against here in a little bit, and that is, that markets on one side are seen as evil, they're seen as great on the other end. So I'm really happy to see this particular work and its contribution to it. I was talking to someone else about this event, and they went and looked at the table of contents, and they were an economist, and they were like, oh yeah, hey, you've got this nice clean section about economics, and it is so clear and concise that I almost like that it is that informed outsider coming in and talking about it, that I would turn that over to one of my students to try to understand market design better. And then a section on theology that lays the groundwork for what comes next, but allows us economists to better understand this. And then finally, of course, bringing the two areas together. So the layout of the book is just fantastic. So I consider Butner's work to be timely, and in many ways, maybe a long time coming. So not only have theologians viewed markets with suspicion, and economists have championed them as inherently beneficial, but this divide has hindered conversation, dialogue between us over the years. I consider this book to be a more mature perspective. Markets are neither wholly good nor entirely bad. And economic determinism isn't the only lens through which we can view the world. Theology has a role to play too. I'm going to come back to this a couple different times as I talk through what I like about it and then what questions I have for Glenn. But I think he's opening up the space for action and inquiry that wasn't there before, and that this is exciting, but also has a lot that needs to be worked out to do it. So he's talking about doing this integration at every step of the economic analysis. And this is something I wholeheartedly support. The question, of course, are in the details. So let me go back. And even one of the places he's talking about where theology can have a role is even from the get-go. What data are we using, and how are we using that data? Certainly, the data we use is going to have influence on our understanding on our policies, but no one really challenges the data that we're examining. So I'm a macroeconomist, and so as an example, economic growth often stands out as a macroeconomic policy objective, but this may be partly due to the accessibility and understanding of GDP data relative to, say, measures of inequality or well-being, then to some explicit conscious decision to prioritize growth over other possible goals. Of course, Butner also underscores how economic models shape our policy. So not just data, but our models, including, of course, models of self-interested agents that need to be re-examined or put into proper context. And theology can help provide that context. So our inputs of analysis are certainly going to affect the output of analysis. It's not just data and models that are selected without reference to theology, but so too are our policy goals and the market institutions themselves. And again, the market design piece for me is a wonderful contribution that Glenn is making. And so for me, I can't reiterate enough that what I really like about this work is he's opened up the space for actions that were previously unimaginable when markets were perceived as unequivocally good or evil, or when outcomes were seen as predetermined. Theology not only allows us to think about new questions, but challenges us to answer them. So for instance, if theology suggests broader goals for macroeconomic policy than economic growth and stabilization, the question then turns to, what weight should we give these goals and why? Right? So once you spread out the goals, okay, well, what weight happens to them, and is there a basis for that? So these questions, though, easily beget more questions. Where do we stop? This brings me to my questions for Dr. Butner. And what is, he can interpret this however he wants, but my original intent on this first question is really on the practicalities of how we interact. And so my question is this: how can economists and theologians collaborate effectively to develop approaches that reflect both economic realities and ethical imperatives? This seems challenging, particularly because economists and theologians tend to view the world through such different lenses, and because research and policy work tends to be siloed by discipline. I was really appreciative of Steve's, not just his comment, Steve McMullen in this particular case, of his comments, but actually putting a word on the theocrat of virtue. I loved that, right? And so how do we generate these folks? Is it a separate institute that we come up with and find some funds for or whatever? How do we actually produce these folks who would both keep in mind theology, ethics, philosophy, and economics as they are doing their work. Second, how far can theology take us to improving economic analysis and policymaking? I think it can take us a lot further than we currently are, but might it raise more questions than it answers? I would think such questions could easily overwhelm economists, right? Because, I mean, again, we're opening up a lot more space so you have to be thinking about more things than before. We might be thinking about a wider range of data, a wider set of models and assumptions on those models, a wider set of institution considerations and goals and their expected outcomes for any given socioeconomic problem. So a lot more analysis, I think, would need to be going on in this wider space that we're talking about. Even then, we may still get things wrong, and obviously probably we will. So we must also consider the potential risk of trying to make any improvements. So I'm going to use an example that Glenn brings up in the book. He talks about a car dealership moving to a fixed price model, and that would reduce discrimination. Yet, I would argue that not all discrimination leads to injustice, right? So actions intended to produce justice, like offering discount to that single working mother, might actually be inadvertently hindered under a fixed price model. So discrimination, sometimes we think about it working toward bad, but in some cases it can work toward good. So my third question builds off the second one. How can we ensure that theology-informed changes in data collection, model building, goal setting, and institution designing will lead to better outcomes? Fourth, and finally my questions, I still have some more comments, but fourth and finally my questions, does theology lose some of its potency when it shifts from being a critic to being an agent of change in refining economic analysis and policy? Sort of the sense of being outside the citadel, if you will. Still, Butner's reference to the doctrine of concurrence, that markets, in this case, result from divine providence, but also can be improved through human agency, offers both hope and a call for action. If, as he writes, certain market design methods, for example, can help reduce structures of sin and make participants more receptive to common grace, should we not pursue them? Butner suggests that markets are imagined. I like this. It's true. In other words, they are a product of human creativity. How we deal with pollution is just one example. Here, we imagine pollution rights as a commodity that is traded in a market so that we might incentivize innovation and pollution reduction. Without that imagination, we would struggle more than we are now to bring down pollution levels efficiently. Now, I bring this up because I would also argue that it takes imagination to consider a wider range of possibilities for economic analysis and policymaking. And Butner has shown that theology can help us do just that. Nonetheless, my concern I think with time and energy we can work out, and certainly in Glenn's next book on this, his follow-up to this, by opening up the space for imagining how economics and theology can interact, a lot of questions need to be answered. Of course, these are worthy of our consideration. For Butner's work in opening up the space, I am profoundly grateful, and I look forward to continued work by Glenn and others in this vital area. Excellent job, Glenn. And so now, after these brief questions that we've been asking, we're going to turn it back over to Glenn so he can respond to us.
Well, thanks to all of the respondents for your kind analysis. It's a bit intimidating as a theologian to come in and have two very gifted economists weigh in on my understanding of economics. So, but I appreciate the opportunity to learn from you and to continue learning from Steve Long as well, as I have for quite a while now. I appreciate your pushback and all of your insightful questions. And I don't have time to answer all of them. And some of them I'm going to answer inadequately for time's sake, but I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and do the best that I can to answer as many as I can, starting with 3 more theological questions from Steve Long, and then moving to something of a combined answer between Rob Tatum and Steve McMullen. So, Divine Economy may have been written a quarter of a century ago, but it does have a lasting impact today. Its influence on my own book should be evident in my desire to move beyond the doctrines of creation or eschatology. And it's also evident in my efforts to interrogate the disciplines of economics from a position of some familiarity with the discipline's content, something I think Long has done impressively. There are many other points of indebtedness In fact, when I decided to apply for PhD programs almost 15 years ago, the first supervisor I sought out was the author of Divine Economy. So I'm thankful to Steve for his participation on this panel. I'm going to do my best to try and answer your really solid questions in very limited time. So let's start with why still work with the fact-value distinction? So those several of you who have read Work Out Your Salvation, and I know most of you haven't, may have noticed that I argue for a weak version of the fact-value or positive normative distinction, largely in dialogue with economists or analytic philosophers like A.J. Ayer, Mark Blogg, Hilary Putnam, or John Lunn and Robin Clay. Admittedly, the goal is pragmatic. I want to convince any economist readers who don't think theology has a place at the table in market design that they're wrong, while affirming a standard conceptual apparatus in the discipline of economics. I even joke at the start of the chapter that those who agree with theology having a role in economics might skip the chapter, quote, as led by God or by marginal utility analysis. So no doubt it was his distaste for marginal utility analysis that led Long to keep reading the chapter. So it's only fair that I base the distinction in a more robust theological explanation, since one was admittedly absent in the book. So here's my best quick answer. It is an appeal to the doctrine of divine simplicity, which states that God is not composed of parts. Accordingly, truth and goodness are the same thing in God. God is wholly good, and God is wholly true, and in the end, God is goodness and truth. So we can think of Scripture, I am the way, the truth, and the life, or no one is good but God alone. That's all to say that in God, there is no fact-value distinction. But the doctrine of simplicity also safeguards the creator-creature distinction, such that the composite, complex, created world is distinct from the simple God, in that A, God is the explanation of creation, since all composed realities need explanation, and B, the properties of created things are dependent upon God. It is a commonplace of much theology, and Steve, I know you agree, to affirm that created being participates in divine being. And from this participation, creation is what it is. In other words, created goodness shares in divine goodness, and created truth in divine truth, such that both are dependent on God. But this participation is analogical. There's always a greater difference between created goodness and divine goodness than similarity between the two. But there is a similarity. And so when I see created goodness, I can learn something of divine goodness, provided my eyes are open to see it. But what I know of created goodness will be imperfect knowledge of divine goodness. What is united in the simple God, then, is analogically reflected as plural in the created world, as one cause to many effects, or as many created beings participating in one, capital B, being. Created goodness and created truth are thus distinct, though always inseparable in my mind. This distinction may be something like the virtual distinction of Thomas Aquinas, so that truth or goodness, or fact and value, are known as distinct in a creaturely way, though they are one in God. But this virtual distinction is based on something in God, such that the distinction is not worthless. After all, I think there is a fact-value distinction in the theological disciplines as well, between something like the historical analysis of Scripture and moral theology. I just don't think we can divide the two there. So in the end, I'm trying to reject a full distinction between fact and values, and certainly mapping values onto theology and facts onto economics. While I do think there's reason to retain some distinction there, as a result of our created world being distinct and different from the God in whom those two things converge as one. That's pretty brief and probably my most technical answer in this part, but hopefully it's worth something. Skipping, here's another set of questions from Steve. Who designs markets? How do we generate a politics and culture that recognizes that they're designed? And then how does this design differ from socialism? I think the first part of the question is the easiest, because lots of groups design markets. Some of these groups, especially economists, I'd think, would intentionally be designing markets, but others may not be aware of what they're doing. And so I point also to the same story you just heard from Rob Tatum of the car dealership that changed from a haggling model, which they found hurt vulnerable customers, to a sticker price model. That was market design. And there may still need to be further tweaks to be able to give that discount to the mother in need. But I don't think that that dealership was intentionally thinking in terms of market design, even as they were undertaking it. And that's a little bit different from the economist who does market design. Now, Steve, you're more of an expert in socialism than I am, but I understand socialism to also involve questions of property or ownership. And this book doesn't address that extremely important question. And so I think that leaves open the possibility that socialism could be market design, but also that other forms of market design might be more capitalist depending on the distribution of property there. As to the question of how do we shift culture so that it recognizes markets as malleable, I'm influenced by James Davison Hunter's To Change the World, in which he argues that culture often changes when networks and institutions controlled by people near the center of cultural influence do something new. Such changes are rarely planned or predictable, so Hunter doesn't advocate for intentional cultural change, but for something more like faithful presence. So I would advocate the same, also pulling on the concept of subsidiarity. Personally, I'd be thrilled if this book prompted some small Christian businesses to rethink the markets they help construct, or if a few Christian economists took these insights and ran with them. And honestly, even that goal may be too ambitious. I don't know what's going to happen with this book. But I would hope that this work, once digested by the academy and, Lord willing, taught in seminaries or business schools, could help churches to faithfully and intentionally disciple their members toward more faithful market design, even if society as a whole remains culturally influenced to think that markets are spontaneous and natural. And this brings up Long's fourth question. If the Spirit works sanctifying grace through the market, could the market replace the church without loss? And he is right. Definitely not, is my answer. But here's the why. Let's imagine in an impossible world that we could get 100% of our sanctification in market contexts. Even if that could happen, and I don't think it could, the church would still retain its unique role in the proclamation of the gospel, for example. But I don't think that 100% of sanctification does occur in markets. For one, I argue that common grace is oriented to special grace. So whatever's happening in markets can help the church, but not replace it. Whatever of benefit is happening in markets, it is oriented to the greater transformation available in the church. Often markets do more to impede sanctification. In fact, in the book, I think I provide far more examples of ways to fix markets so they stop hurting sanctification than I provide examples that directly contribute to sanctification. This leads to a second point. The Spirit can sanctify using instrumental causes of various sorts, including markets. This is part of divine omnipotence. But the primary secondary causes, the primary means of grace, are and will remain preaching and the sacraments. These belong to the church, and as such, the church is indispensable. That'll have to do for a cursory theological response. I'd love to talk with you more about them sometime. But for now, I'm going to turn and address the questions, concerns, and insights of Drs. McMullen and Tatum. And I'm quite grateful when anyone reads my work, but even more so when they do so charitably and insightfully. So thank you both for your questions and your comments. In seminary in particular, I was exposed to a number of theologians who read economists from a hermeneutic of suspicion, as if they were the enemy. That is, assuming they read economists at all. In my doctoral program, a few years later, I presented a paper on early content for this book as a panel, or part of a panel at an academic conference, and a respondent from a political science department focused on all the other papers and only briefly replied to me that most economists he knew were trying to be good people. I could not figure out what in the paper had led him to make that remark, as I hardly intended to condemn all economists, and I thought my paper was rather conciliatory. But some reflection led me to recognize other theologians who would have been fine with such a condemnation, and perhaps leading this political science professor to read my words as more combative than I intended, or maybe they were more combative than I intended. My point is that because of these experiences, I've worked pretty hard to read economists with a quite strong hermeneutic of charity. So I am at once thankful, and I find it quite ironic that McMullen needed to give me a note of caution, being an economist, reminding a theologian not to read economists quite so charitably, but with a bit more suspicion. Your point on the contentiousness of experimental economics is well taken, though with a note of disappointment, as the subdiscipline does a little bit of load-bearing work in certain parts of the book. And I'm hoping some of those findings stand the test of further time and scrutiny. But I concede your far greater expertise and just say, oh, whoops, my bad. Turning to your questions, though, I want to note a common feature of your wording that helps me clarify an important point. So Rob asked a question, technically before his official questions for me. He says, if theology suggests broader goals for macroeconomic policy than economic growth and stabilization, the question then turns to, what weight should we give to these goals and why? Steve asked a briefer question, also not highlighted for me to answer, but he begins with, where does that leave us? And I note the first person plural pronouns here as something that should give us pause. because who is referenced as us or we? Do these pronouns reference participants in the discussion, Christians, Americans or Brits, all citizens of globalized market economies? I would think the answer to each of your questions that follow will in many respects be different depending on what group is pointed to with the terms we and us. And I know in the introduction I use similar pronouns without precise antecedents, so I'm guilty of this too. That's just a feature of these sort of panels. So I'm not intending any sort of critique, but just a starting point for dialogue. So noting that, I want to turn to a pair of similar questions from both of you. McMullen wonders whether the critical projects of Tanner, Smith, Long, and others should be abandoned. And Tatum asks whether theology loses some of its potency when it shifts from being a critic to being an agent of change in refining economic analysis and policy. So first, thanks for appreciating the value of theological critique. As a theologian, I sometimes worry that only other theologians care about the social critiques of theologians, so it's nice to see you both valuing the work. Second, though, I'd like to answer this question more seriously by connecting it to my note about pronouns. If the question is, where does my project leave the United States or the United Kingdom? I have to imagine that constructive collaboration with theologians will not be quite so welcome. Partly, this is institutional through things like the legal value of the separation of church and state in the United States. Partly, this is due to the pluralistic nature of each community combined with increasing secularism. Surely, there will be some concerns in which consensus can be reached across a wide range of religions and philosophies, such as designing markets more immune to corruption, whether we're thinking of the tax systems devised in the Palace of Westminster or investing on Wall Street. Surely such consensus is evidence of common grace. Yet I doubt it goes very far into the heart of Christian conviction or theology. As such, in the public sphere, at the national or international level, I would say there's probably a good deal of room for a very long time to come left for projects like Long's, Tanner's, Smith's, or even Gustavo Gutierrez's, though each are also open to some critique. On the other hand, if we designates Christians, I would say that critical projects ought to be somewhat chastened from the level that they sometimes occupy. If all economics is primarily subject to critique, that would include the economic work of Christian economists. But insofar as they are the body of Christ, such economists have something to bring to the table. As Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 12, Christians are the body, and the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, or again, the head can't say to the feet, I don't need you. Theologians can't only merely always critique the contributions of economists, including Christian economists. For to do so is for one part of the body to tell another it has no need of it. And so there is need for constructive projects among Christian theologians and economists, and that's what I'm trying to do. Yet, I will quickly add a favorite quote in theology from Jürgen Moltmann, who's hardly a fan of capitalism and markets, but a good theologian to remind us of the dogmatic role of the doctrine of eschatology, the last things. So Moltmann writes, and here's a quote, "Those who hope in Christ can no longer put up with reality as it is, but begin to suffer under it, to contradict it. Peace with God means conflict with the world." And here's my favorite part. "For the goad of the promised future stabs inexorably into the flesh of every unfulfilled present." To not try to foster collaborative, constructive projects, I think would be despair, but to settle for them would be presumption. I can certainly hope that my own work and any constructive projects that emerge from it would be subject to critical projects, and I would be honored if those projects were half as strong as Long's or Tanner's. Any Christian market design with moral formation in mind is insufficient compared to the future perfect glory we all await in the kingdom. And so I think that answers McMullen's second question then too. What should our posture be toward the economy? Our posture should be one neither of pure suspicion nor of mere happiness with institution building. Rather, in hope, I think we should strive to live in a way that anticipates the kingdom and Savior who is our true object of hope. And this life is marked by both suspicion of markets and capitalism and by simultaneous cautious institution building. I want to turn now to a speed round of several of Rob's questions. First, how can theologians and economists collaborate given specialization and disciplinary differences? A silly answer, but Luke 1:37, nothing is impossible with God. More seriously, I would love to see something like a Lilly grant for a research project in which a few theologians and economists sit down and perform a few correspondence studies, combined with a robust discussion of the ethics of discrimination. a term I use to refer to an injustice based on identity, but you've used more broadly to refer to any preferential treatment. And I grant your point there. But that shows it's going to take work to find common vocabulary, much less larger conceptual frameworks. But I think with funding, patience, and a small enough focus, I think we could have some really interesting conversations, provided that we have a robust enough experimental methodology to be able to carry any weight. Second, might theology raise more questions than it answers if integrated with economics? To be honest, I value a good question more than a good answer. Partly that's because we can rarely answer questions with clear data of the sort that the social sciences have. A question opens up a line of inquiry, new insights, and even more questions. I know I've raised more questions than I've answered in my book, and despite my efforts to have practical applications, I've used up my only 3 ideas for mixing experimental economics, market design, and theology. Partly that's because I've identified relevant economic conversations over the last decade, largely by scouring footnotes, searching JSTOR, and sometimes Googling. So now that you've welcomed me into the KLC Econ Hub, hopefully I'll have better sources and can grow this project a little more. Third, and finally, how far can theology take us in improving economic analysis and policymaking? I don't really know, given that I'm neither an economist or a politician. Much of the presentation today, like much of the book, is admittedly addressed to economists, but much of it is also directed to theologians. And I think the biggest impact the book might have is showing theologians what economics is really trying to do. When I first became a Christian, I was attending a Christian high school and was in a Bible class that helped spark my interest in these questions. There we read David Nobel's Understanding the Times, a curriculum that taught me worldview analysis, including that communism was the official economic system of Marxism and atheism its official religion, while Christianity was marked by an official economic system of capitalism. I know a few theologians who would beg to differ. Of course, at the time, I wanted to adopt a Christian worldview, so I had to be a good capitalist, but that meant endorsing almost anything done in the name of capitalism. Now, I doubt most in this Zoom adopt anything a quarter as simplistic as the curriculum I was taught, and even it had benefits, I want to be clear. But when the discourse is largely about whether capitalism and markets are good or bad, and when that's taught in seminary classrooms in a simplified form, and when that's then passed down to Bible classrooms in a simplified form, you can kind of understand why I got the curriculum I did. So I hope, and perhaps too proudly think, that this book could help the most with changing that conversation in seminary classrooms and, as a result, in high school classrooms, so that Christians learn to think about individual issues and markets rather than to endorse all markets because capitalism is Christian, or, for that matter, to reject all markets because capitalism is unchristian. There's a better conversation to be had, and I believe that conversation would benefit not only policymaking, but the church and civil society as a whole. So those are my replies. Thanks everyone for being here. We've got about 15 minutes left for questions on the dot. And so if you just want to use the raise hand feature, all panelists are going to come back on the screen and we can all weigh in on whatever questions you have for one of us or all of us. Though I'm asked to remind you to keep your preface to questions minimal, please. So, okay, I see an Edwin who has put his hand up.
Yes, you were talking about Amazon. We all use Amazon every day, and we don't think about not using Amazon. But we know the profits they're making. I mean, I use Amazon quite a bit, mainly for books and bits and pieces. But we all use Amazon. And they're making a lot of money, Amazon, from the people.
Yeah, that's true. I use Amazon in the book as an example of market design. I think one reason they make so much money from all of us is they were really intuitive at designing a market with the emergence of sort of the dot-coms in the 90s. And so they're a great example of market design, even as at the end of the day, I have some moral concerns about Amazon and admittedly more things to learn about the corporation. So I'm trying to look into my own Amazon use a little more and would encourage the same to anyone else, but not giving a definitive answer on that.
See, the problem with Amazon, if you go to a bookshop in London, a big bookshop like Waterstones or even Thralls, you can't get these books and we're full of universities in London. Amazon can get them.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts and your reflections. Christina McRory, I see you've got the hand up there. Good to see you.
Yeah, hey. I'll try to be brief, but let me begin by saying this is fantabulous. I've spent most of yesterday with your book, and oh my goodness, it feels like we've cared about the same things for like what, 5-6 years now. So I'm loving this.
Longer than that, yeah.
Oh my gosh, this is great. Good job. I have two questions, and both of them are oriented towards being interests that I have, and I want to learn from how you're thinking about this. The first one is related to one of Steve's questions, Steve McMullen, and it's about how you decide which literature in economics to engage, and then how you engage it when you do. So this is something that I've been thinking a lot about as I'm also pulling together work like this. One of the questions that I have for myself is how to decide what a study says morally, because that's not at all on the radar of the people designing the study or writing about it. Like, they don't care about Christian virtue. So I'm thinking of the Haifa daycare case, which of course philosophers love to talk about, but we wildly disagree in how we read morally what's going on. Is it totally appropriate that the parents respond in this way? Or, as you suggest in one of your pages, is it a kind of inducement to acting towards others in sinful ways? So I guess I'm wondering if you have thought about any guidelines for how to read, like when pro-social behavior is indicative of like a disposition that's virtuous or something. And my second question is, mostly because I haven't finished your final chapters yet, do you have a sketch of what a good market design looks like? Like, what are the features of virtuous markets that we should be out there encouraging? If you're able to sum it up in a kind of tweet for those of us who haven't made it through the last 60 pages yet. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll cut it off
Thanks.
with that.
Wonderful questions. And if either economist wants to point out any tips on how to find literature, I was serious in my in there. Sterling College doesn't have an economics department, and I don't have many economist friends, and I'm not the type to just cold call people. So literally, I find relevant literature just by doing random searches on JSTOR and then seeing who is citing what. And then when I notice a pattern, I start reading it. And so some of your articles help me find things, some stuff by Kate Ward, just bumbling into different discussions. And then I find everything that cites it that I can, and I try and read it and somewhat minimally understand the math component of it. So that's a very unhelpful answer to identify a literature that's relevant. I think, and it may discredit my book. But I think at a more helpful level, how do I think about what it says morally? In one level, the main thing I'm trying to prove with experimental economics is just that if we change the market structure, there are different outcomes that appear to be morally relevant. But I think because of that blurred fact value distinction, there are certain assumptions going into the design of an experiment like this that don't anticipate the questions that a Christian ethicist or theologian would have. And so I attempt to express those things as somewhat tentative, because the experiment wasn't designed to determine the moral outcomes. And I'd like to think that there would be a way to design it so that we could have more firm conclusions about what's happening with, the daycare transition. But I think that would take a new experiment to have extremely strong conclusions there. Or else, if I find a pattern that has some sort of external corroboration. So one thing with the chapter on economic inequality, producing vice, I'm not in a position to weigh in extremely heavily on the quality of these experiments. I can say that I found a lot of them that seem to point in a similar direction, but that just could be a bias across the board. But I do find theological and scriptural reasons to suspect that wealth is going to cause moral problems. And so given that external evidence, I say, well, that seems reason to me to think that this empirical evidence likely fits the biblical evidence, which likely fits theological accounts of virtue. And so that's how I would evaluate it, is partly relying on outside evidence, since I'm somewhat limited in my ability to grasp the full mathematics or experiment design. So both of those I try to use experimental economics a lot, but I don't know that I'm in a position to take you very much further in how to engage them. I don't know if that's helpful at all. Second, what's a good market design sketch? That's an awesome question that I wish my next time I'm going to have a canned answer for that. I think I would attend to so moral formation and justice. I didn't even consider justice, but what are the distributive effects of markets? I think I would attend to what are the intentions that the way that this market is working is acting. I think I would attend to what knowledge is available, and is the information that's available sufficient for you to use moral reasoning appropriately. So like Steve, if all you have is price, I don't think that's enough information to know, like, am I buying something that was made in a sweatshop? Am I buying something that is going to morally corrupt me? And so I think those are a few of the questions I would think about. And then how does a particular market design change our behavior? I think would be another important question. Some of those changes might be relatively insignificant morally, but I think others of them would be quite important. So, Rob, is that a comment on her questions, or is that a question yourself?
Go ahead with Bruce, and then I'll go after that.
Okay. Hi, Bruce. I think it's your turn.
Okay, I think you said something I didn't understand. You said incentive undermines the Holy Spirit. Did I get it wrong?
Not quite. You didn't quite get it wrong, and that's not quite what I said. So, or maybe it's what I said in my very reduced version. That was the problem with reconstructing a chapter in a minute. Basically, I found some experimental evidence, the crowding out effect, for example, that suggests that oftentimes adding an incentive replaces the existing motive for an action with a new motive based on financial remuneration. Christina, actually, in a conference, we had her out to Sterling College, I don't remember, 2017, a long time ago. And she pushed me on that some and said, well, actually, sometimes there's a crowding in effect. And so now I try to be more careful and say this isn't always the case. But I draw on a range of ethicists that say part of sanctification is desiring to act due to the intrinsic good of an action and of the person being acted toward. And that the financial compensation of an action is sort of an extrinsic good in a lot of contexts. The way I define incentives, like salary isn't an incentive because it's part of the nature of work that you receive the fruits of your labor. But if I'm paying my kids to get good grades, they might work to get good grades, but they might only care about the money and care a little bit less about school than they used to. That may not be the case, so we need to examine more. But if incentives sort of crowd out that intrinsic desire toward the good, I would think that intrinsic desire toward the good is part of sanctification. And so that's potentially a concern that isn't at all in the mind of scholars that have done those experiments with incentives. But I would certainly want to look into that more if I had a massive grant budget and a few economists willing to work with me, which I have not either, to my knowledge. So I don't know, does that help clarify what I was?
Yeah.
Okay. Trying to scroll back and forth to see hands, or Rob, you may have your chance now.
All right, let me use this to transition to some closing announcement here in a moment by the leader of KLC, which is Craig Bartholomew, who is here. But it's interesting, you raised something a moment ago in a very small way when you were talking to Christina. It's, some of this is how do we work into another area that we don't have PhDs or terminal degrees in. And I find that difficult as an economist. And so, it speaks to me about, collaboration. You spoke about the possibility of a Lilly grant, which I think that's fabulous. But even sort of those small things that you were just talking about. The other day, I was asking my research assistant to, find me some theological literature. And I'm not sure I actually know the best way that I go about looking for literature and theology. And so just a quick on that one, you may know this already, but you were talking about JSTOR versus Google and all that. In econ, the thing I do at least, is econ lit. And so it's a database that you can go through and look for economic research. And we have our own sort of Dewey Decimal System, if you will, called the JEL code. And so the books or the articles that you see will have the JEL codes there, and it's good to search by that. But often I do what you're doing when I'm looking at theology, look at the footnotes, see who they're citing, all that sort of thing, see the citations, all that sort of stuff. But something like Econ Lit would be a useful way, if you're not already using it, to find more literature in a particular area. So I think sometimes it's actually those little things that we need to know more about each other. And then, of course, the big questions that you bring up on how we can collaborate. I think this is awesome. I'm so glad to have this book, and I hope others read it. And so many of us got an advanced copy, or the three panelists here have an advanced copy. So it's just come out, what, last month? Is that right?
Yes, about
Okay.
6 weeks ago, maybe something like that. I can't remember.
Yeah, so hot off the press, if you will. And so before I turn it over to Craig, does anybody on the panel have any final comments you need to make or want to make?
Thanks again, everyone, for being here.
Yeah, this is awesome. So let me open the door to Craig. It's good to see you, Craig.
Yeah, thank you. And Rob, thank you for letting me just say a few words right at the end. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Kirby Lang Center, and I can't tell you how grateful I am for our economics hub and for Rob and the others of you who lead that. And, you know, this kind of event is right at the heart of the vision of the Kirby Lang Center. And Glenn, congratulations on your book, and thank you for participating in this fascinating dialogue. It's also good to see people like Steve again, who I was at a conference with some years ago. Now, and you know, I just wanted to say a few things right at the end. I promise not to take long. You know, I like to be a good theologian, so I was a bit late because I was shopping, and I picked up the latest Economist. Now, you won't believe what is on the cover. Can you read that? On the cover at the bottom is Economists and God. And there is an article in The Economist, this one, which is called Money and Religion, God. Now, I just want to read to you one paragraph. I've just browsed it, but it was so serendipitous to see this. And I bought this Economist because I saw this. One paragraph: divinity departments are staffed by theologians rather than economists. The idea of mixing the dismal science, that, by the way, is economics, with the divine strikes many people at the very least as odd, and at worst strikes them as blasphemous. So, and you know, one thing I would just encourage our economics hub is to have a look at this. And you know, we've got to find a way sometime to get the message out there that actually there's hosts of people who are doing this hard work. So it was very interesting. The second thing I just wanted to alert you to is that the hard copy of our accessible magazine in public theology, The Big Picture 11, has just been published. And I hope you can see what the theme of it is: economics. And some of the authors are on this Zoom. We are now distributing hard copy. The electronic copy will appear free on the Kirby Lang Center website, but we are now distributing hard copy in the US, the UK, Europe, and South Africa. And so, you know, this is there's some really interesting stuff. Our guest editor was Peter Heslin, who some of you know. And and, you know, just Glenn, what we are trying to do at the Kirby Lang Center, we now have a 10-year vision, which we think is realizable, at the end of which we would have a campus in Cambridge. And we are trying to build a wineskin that could host projects such as you described, funded by the Lilly Foundation, which could work in partnership with a whole host of institutions, but whose remit would be to pursue with all the intellectual rigor we can muster the relationship between Christianity, theology, and economics. And, you know, the needs of our day in this area could not be overstated. So this is just, I just wanted to say hello to you all. Thank you so much for your work, and encourage you to, you know, if you're willing to sign up for our website, for our newsletter. But I know I, like you, don't want my inbox full of newsletters all the time. If you're a Christian academic and you'd like to be an associate fellow of the Kirby Lang Center, we would welcome that, and it comes with no strings attached. What our vision is to support you in your really critical scholarship, rather than asking, what can you do for us? Okay, Rob, thank you so much. This has just been a wonderful event.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, everyone. And hopefully there'll be more like this. And I can't wait for more scholarship in this area and more collaboration in this area. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Glenn.